Hey there, how we doing, Golden Bears? I hope you're feeling classy and keeping it classy as I know you always do. Well, hey, we're going to be kicking off Module 2.2 where we now begin delving deeply into England's desire for cash and a cash crop. And that eventually leads to starting the colonies and expanding into our use of tobacco and sugar and sadly into this system called slavery. But before we jump in, let's start with a little brief story here. It became crazily apparent to me when in March I went to Las Vegas with a friend and it was just post-COVID and it was strangely weird. I don't go to Vegas too often, and when you do go there, it is just almost gaudy with the sounds, the sights, the buildings, the sheer huge nature of them, and unique architecture of them. Everything from the pyramids in the Nile to the Venetian, areas of Italy, and then always down to the balmy tropics of the Tropicana, if you will. I mean, they have everything for every person. What became apparent to me is how money-starved they are and how craving they are to seek after the customer. What does that mean? Is that they will renovate and duplicate and come up with something new or swipe someone else's idea. I mean, one casino started years and years ago, the Cirque du Soleil. Now, every hotel has to have a Cirque du Soleil. Once offered smoke-free gambling. Now all of them offer that type of thing. Another one offered, I think it was the Caesars offered this incredible spa package. Now every one of them has spas that will rival something that emperors could go to. It basically, Las Vegas is after one thing: my money. As the consumer, I am their cash crop. I am the one that they want to lure into their casinos so I can be willing to open up my wallet, lay down some money, and lose. That's the idea behind it. And you say, wait a minute, Steger, what does what does the Las Vegas have to do with the colonies? Well, everything. Las Vegas is just after my money as the cash crop. Well, the colonies were started after one thing, and that is cash crop called tobacco, or cash crop called rice, cash crop called sugar. And these things were pursued relentlessly and feverishly, and almost to the tune of where life itself became meaningless within the context of the slave movement. So with that, why don't we dive in and unpack a little bit about the first British colonies there on American soil. So I love this quote by another author who writes textbooks for college kids, and he says, Virginia's prosperity was finally built on tobacco smoke. This bewitching weed played a vital role in putting the colony on firm economic foundations. If you remember, most European powers came to the New World, just like Spain, looking for gold and looking for silver. Well, what they found in Virginia was nothing at all of gold or silver. When the colonists came to Plymouth, they found nothing at all that resembled gold and silver. And so they had to learn new things or new aspects of how to see that land and what can they do with it. Like looking left and right, like, well, there's no gold and silver here. What else can we do? And with that, along comes tobacco, which we'll talk about here in a moment. A couple of things that we're going to examine in today is the environmental factors and how they influence the development of the Chesapeake region. We're going to talk about how, even though colonies, you would think, are similar in so many ways because they speak English and many of them follow the king, but they have very differences in how they approach their leadership and how they approach their economies and their social structures. We also need to recognize the importance of the cash crop tobacco, which thus then creates the need for the slave labor system in 1619 and beyond. This is a great chart that I encourage all of my students, especially if you're taking the exam, to complete and pay attention to. My illustration for this is simply there are let's say 20 Costco's here in the Southern California, San Diego and Riverside County areas. And each Costco from the outside looks identical. Same coloring, same signage, might look different that the gas station is a different location. But the moment you go in, vastly different. You can walk in one store and immediately you'll find TVs. You walk into another store, you'll find refrigerators, and you'll make your way back. There'll be the freezers on one side for the frozen food and hard commodity goods on another. They're not at all set up equally. In fact, the Costco in our region here, they might have a pretty decent wine selection, let's say, but you go to La Jolla down in San Diego where there's an ample amount of money. I was there not recently, and there was one bottle of, I don't know if I should be talking about this, but you're college-age kids, and you can appreciate that. There was one bottle of a whiskey from Ireland that was for $18,000. What caused that? It's just crazy. Well, each Costco is reflecting its neighborhood and has various areas to shop in there that mirror what their clients might want. It's no different there in the colonies. Each colony took on a different approach and a different methodology of how to consider the environment, how to consider what the resources that were available to them, how to consider which native populations live nearby them. And so to say that all the colonies, all 13 colonies, were identical is a complete error of historical judgment. So please go with me today as we unpack how does the first colony of Virginia and then into Maryland and Carolina fit within the scheme of things. So that takes us to number one, the economic causes of this reason to colonize. Well, England is beginning to undergo a lot of challenges, okay? Wars with France are depleting their funds by the tunes of millions of dollars. Ireland and the conquest of it went off quite flawlessly, sadly, yet that brutality of how they treated them, namely, you need to watch the movie Braveheart if you want to be clarified as to how the British took over the Irish people, kind of fueled their desire of nationalistic tendencies to want to expand. While at the same time, Spain was kicking it. They were having an easy job of making money. Why? Because they kept extracting more and more wealth from the encomienda system and the mining systems that were down in Mexico and other Latin American countries, as we know it. We call it Mesoamerica. What did this lead to? Well, a major inflationary prices all across Europe, but primarily it hit England hard. Yeah, the wealthy people, they don't mind. They can still buy a bed if the bed cost 100% more than it did 3 years ago. But what about the poor person? What about the homeless person? When the cost of lettuce goes up, by 100%, that's a whole different ballgame. And this is what the easy money that came into Spain, then competing for the goods to purchase, caused major problems in Europe and primarily in England. We call this inflation. And this became a perfect storm. Now, to meet this perfect storm, the wealthy people of England who owned all of the land, the nobles, came up with this thing called the enclosure movement. And this enclosure movement, on one hand, was good. How was it good? Well, it put up fences or rock fences to make sure that certain property lines were respected. But before they put in the fences, they leveled off the land, they created drainage, this eliminated erosion, and lastly, those fences made sure that certain animals wouldn't break into a neighboring farm or their own farm and begin eating the crops that they'd worked so hard to create. Now, the problem with this came with is all these public lands that now became privatized essentially kicked off all of the poor people who were vagrants or squatters and led them who were able to eke out a living or just at least feed themselves now had no capacity to do so. What was the result? They were homeless and they head into London or Manchester or other parts of industrialized England. I wouldn't call it industrialized, but at least more popularized areas and just were homeless during this time. So what would I call this as an example? Well, in Temecula Valley High School during these warm months of August and September, man, shade is a commodity. And if you're a senior, you have no problem getting to the shaded areas because you're older, maybe more respected, maybe your body demeanor and features are stronger. And kid you not, the freshmen, when they come in, they're like, looking around. They don't know what to do. They can't go sit in the shaded area because all the shaded areas are taken already by the seniors. And even if they did have the gall to go in where the seniors were, it'd be like, hey, get away, you punk. This is just for seniors only. So see ya. And so there you go. See the little freshmen walking away and sweating beneath the heat, wishing that someday they can be a senior themselves. This is a little example of what the enclosure movement was about. Limited amount of shade where just a few people control them, that they call the rules for everyone else. This was a ripe shift in the landscape, if you will, of England that would warrant, let's go find another place to where we can land. All right, so here's a picture of the enclosure movement where you can see how scientifically the government was kind of asking the barons and those who control the public lands to be better stewards of the land. Who essentially lost out on this? These were the poor people of that time who had nothing to show for it. So it was this enclosure movement that essentially created a large landless population that what? They had no idea but to say, well, what is next? So this is where this idea of indentured servitude came into position. If they were homeless and had nowhere to go or were caught stealing, they were thrown into jail, and there the jailer would say, hey, you want a way to get out of this jail sentence? You don't have any future here, boy, girl. Why don't you go to this new colony that they're starting over there in Virginia? It's a place called Jamestown. And you know what? After you're working for a little bit of time, you might be let go. What do you think about that? They're like, well, let's see. Shackles in a prison, or risk it and get over there and maybe have a hope in a future with land in return. This is what I call a timeshare pitch. My in-laws are wonderful people, and a few years ago they were at a Marriott there in Maui, and they went to a timeshare. What timeshare they offered them, I don't know, free meals. I don't know what they got, but it was something to lure them in there. Next thing we know, they come back and tell us, hey, we bought 2 weeks of timeshare there at the Maui Marriott. We're like, oh, cool, that must have been a pretty penny is what we were thinking. And sure enough, it was a shiny, pretty penny. Now, what is this like? Well, they're getting a piece of a Marriott for a limited amount of time. Okay, and yeah, that's great. It's beachfront, get to enjoy all this. But what they didn't know is about the fine print. And this is what we're going to discover about these indentured servants, is that there is a underbelly of a timeshare, and that is the reality of still every year you got to pay taxes. Every year you got to go, when you go visit the facility, you got to pay a fee for cleaning. Then you got to pay a reservation fee. You have all these things. The next thing you know, you just spent $1,000 on a thing that you had already thought you bought, when in actuality you're just paying the annual dues to keep using it. It's kind of a sham. Hope there's no timeshare owner or whatever on this, but strike that from the record. But so this is idealistic kind of what the indentured servants were going to experience by the time they land on the shores there in Jamestown and into Maryland and eventually into the other colonies, is that they're sold a bill of goods. In reality, those bill of goods do not produce like they thought they would. Well, we'll look at these documents when we're in class together. Let us jump into the establishment of Jamestown. Give it up, Jamestown, right? All right. James Brown. Okay, enough of that, Steger. This Jamestown is unique. Now, there is always a trick question that shows up on the AP exam or somewhere near there where they say, Roanoke was the first colony established by the British Empire. You're going to have to say, no, time out, that is not right. The first colony is Jamestown. Roanoke was an established settlement that was for economic purposes, that yes, people came from England, but it wasn't sponsored by the king. And if you've been watching this, right now, we'll probably date ourselves on this, the OBX, the Outer Banks, this is where Roanoke was. And it's a mystery as to what happened to the Roanoke people. Some claim that they were landed there and survived for a while and died. Others claim that they had Native Americans showed up and they left with them and intermarried. There's all sorts of speculations as that, but don't fall dupe for that. But for our sake and kicks and giggles, let's just talk Jamestown is the only one that we kind of need to be mindful of, okay? So what enabled the Jamestown colony or city to start of the Virginia colony is this thing called a joint stock company. And this is a new economic model in which it enables, instead of one person paying for all the boats, namely like in Spain, you had King Philip and Princess Isabella, they were taking on all of the risk, but in return they got all the profit, namely the gold and silver. Okay, well, there weren't people that were prepared to do this, and the king certainly wasn't into this just yet. All right, so private people who were very enterprising says, well, what if we all went together on this? We bought some stock in this company, and if the boat lands and we find gold and silver, woo-hoo, we're all happy. If it sinks, we're sad, but at least the loss is spread out over a lot of people. Not one person loses their family legacy. Okay, this is a lot like, for example, Walt Disney. All right, when Walt Disney started his Disneyland, yeah, I'll bet you some people and family members like, you're doing what, Walt? All we do is make pictures. Why would you go squander your wealth on creating this land for people to escape their everyday problems and put it in California of all places, whatever, you know? And next thing you know, Disneyland is a raging success since 1955. And in order for them to expand, Walt's like, nah, time out. I don't want to have my wealth continue to be, doing this. So they made it a public company, which then people bought stock, and that money of buying stock enabled them to expand into Disney World, and then all to these other places across the globe where Disneyland exists. Namely now, when we go to Disneyland, you can go visit the Star Wars land, which was like, it's as though you're on a set, or really in the planet itself, and with the movie characters walking around. I've heard there was $1 billion just to build that set with the Millennial Falcon and all the rest of that. Crazy. Not one person can afford $1 billion loss, but boy, Walt Disney and the corporation certainly can, because there are hundreds of thousands of people who are owning of stock that then, if it would have tanked, they would have like, okay, well, we all collectively lose some money. If it does well and ticket sales go up, we all collectively do better. So this joint stock company is what really helped fuel the economic capacity for these colonies of starting. And it's what's going to help fuel them to be able to put in tobacco soon, or going to put in rice, or even put in the sugar that we'll talk about briefly there in the Barbados area. So please be mindful that this was an economic adventure that was set forth. This was not a religious one, and and please know that the key date there is 1607 as to when the first city started. Well, when they arrived, they encountered here on this little beautiful green area, this Chief Powhatan. Take a look at this right here, and I love how this artistry has kind of placed him there. Look at the size of that gentleman there. In relationship to the fort, he's like king-like. That's King Kong-like, it is for sure. And I love that symbolically of the size. Why? That is appropriate. Here's this chief that has over 25 to 30 tribes under his leadership, like 16,000 warriors at his beck and whistle, okay? And then here we have a bunch of meager, feeble, a few warriors. Yeah, there's John Smith, whatever, he isn't able to fend off all of these things. That is like, come into our area. As long as you stick to your part, we're all cool and we're chill. And he actually kind of thinks to himself, wait a minute, maybe there's some benefits that we can have. We do need some cloth from Europe, pots and pans. And man, if I can get some guns, woo, my power is going to get even better. So this was the initial thing of Powhatan and the confederacy that he had that provided some degree of friendship, but certainly it was about trade for him in that point. So interestingly enough, in this poor developed this Jamestown fort built kind of near a swamp where bugs were festering, near a swamp that had brackish water they couldn't even drink from, near a swamp that couldn't even put rice or anything else to cultivate it from. There they were, surrounded by a bunch of Native Americans. And they wondered, if they were going to survive or not. Well, the only survivor, the way they can have that, is if Powhatan and his Algonquian neighbors were cool with that. Well, why would Powhatan want to capture John Smith? Now, please note, John Smith, he is not the one that is married to Pocahontas, although Disney loves to portray that, and that here's Powhatan, and here's Pocahontas coming down to protect John Smith from being killed. You know what? That isn't the case. That Powhatan, this is actually Pocahontas, yes, but Pocahontas at the age of 10 or 12 was used as a symbolic reference of Powhatan to say, look how kingly we are and civilized we are. She moves in to protect him from being killed. That means he owns loyalty to him forever. All right? Kind of a brilliant strategy there that happens, and all is good until he dies. But then at the same time, we have another character we're going to be introduced to. So here's Pocahontas when she's older. This here's being married to John Rolfe, which is the first guy who brings tobacco to Virginia and to the American colonies. And, there's a story between these two, but very important. Again, a reason to have. Here she's too young, but the chief still can use her in a way to manipulate his power. And then over here, he's using his power and status to also manipulate his way into good graces with his neighboring people. And so without the Powhatan and in this time, there's an internal struggle on the first year that they're together, and there's no way they would have ever made it because John Smith and his group are out busy looking for gold and silver rather than busy to try and find crops and how to survive, because they thought they'd just be there, dig the gold out and go. Well, that turned out not to be the case. A drought hits, and soon foodstuffs are scarce. The Indians are like, we don't want to trade with you because the clothes that you're offering us and other things isn't that much. And what does this do? It creates tremendous tension between both sides of things, and soon we begin seeing tremendous amount of deaths of various people there. And so in order to, survive, Virginia Company began sending over more and more people to recruit more and more settlers so they can afford to send a boat over there. And interestingly enough, despite this boat getting over there, there was a starving time here. And this starving time caused them to cannibalize. In fact, at one point, there were about 60 of them left, we believe, who were on a boat heading back home with probably no food or water in there, barely. And then in comes this boat of 500 settlers. Hooray, hooray, we're saved. They go back to the harbor and they have food and supplies, etc. But what does this mean? Well, it means that this settler's response is that, we'll just go take what we need to from our native neighbors, regardless if we want to keep them as good friends during this time. So here is, I'll talk about this in class as well, so I'll keep going on this. Well, I alluded to this guy named John Rolfe, who discovered, because of the Columbian Exchange, that in Latin, over in south of Mexico, I believe it was this yellow tobacco leaf that when picked and dried, that it had unique properties to it that would make your head spin with nicotine from this wild smoke. And as you change the nutrients value of the soil and did other things and cured them differently, you can actually affect if it has a smoother or a more bitter or more pungent flavors. And so this John Rolfe had unilaterally or on his own had begun determining which tobacco product might be the best, well received. And so soon, he plants this crop, and soon people love it. Then the crop gets more demand, and the demand keeps growing until a crazy amount. And 10 years time goes from a small cash crop to where it is now a cash crop that can support a king and a king's ransom. And so this is where this need for more and more land happens. I mean, people are planting tobacco along the roads or in the pastures, anywhere there was available dirt. They were planting this stuff. What does this mean? More land and more laborers. Where are they going to get the land? That's a collision point that's going to take place with the Native Americans, and Powhatan's son is going to begin fighting with that later on, and it's going to need more for people to work. The solution for this, because the indentured system wasn't providing enough, there weren't enough people imprisoned, I guess, so they then encouraged the wealthy elite farmers who had liaisons there in London, and they said, hey, here's the deal. we will give you an incentive that's called a headright system, that if you get more workers here, we will give you 50 acres for every work you bring. I call it incentive. Back to the timeshare. Don't you think that the timeshare person who's selling you, they get paid a handsome reward for convincing you to buy that timeshare? Yes, they do. So let's say the timeshare is $25K. If they sell it to you, they might get a check for $2,000 right on the spot. That's a pretty good paycheck for, 3 hours worth of work, if you think of that through. So this headright system did lead to more tension with the American Indians, because they needed more labor, but with more colonists, or more, eventual colonists coming over, this created a greater conflict, because more people meant more space, more land. That created increased tension points with them out in the hinterland. So here's a little visual of how the headright system works, and kind of expands it for the colonists there. Well, there's another unique thing of how tobacco fuels this growth in the city of Jamestown, or in the colony of Virginia, is that this House of Burgesses emerges. And you need to be aware of this. You need to know it. You need to imprint it on your brain, because the House of Burgesses has a connection point to our Constitution. Because it's the House of Burgesses which really has two parts to it. One, the king allowed it to form so that way they could begin governing themselves at a quicker and more efficient way on the home front, meaning the Virginian soil. And it enables them to also, as they pass laws, they begin showing signs of a bicameral house. That means two legislative bodies. What is that known as? Eventually, we'll call that the Senate, and we'll call that the Congress. And this is a unique thing. So please bear in mind that the House of Burgesses was probably an early version of a governing body that is showing democratic signs. There's some other colonies that do some similar things. I'll talk about them when we get to that up in either in Pennsylvania, or when we're talking about that up in Massachusetts for here. Well, also around the same time that House of Burgesses was started, there's another ugly thing that emerges in the Virginia colonies, is this idea of slaves. In 1619, a Dutch merchant, some textbooks say it was a Portuguese merchant. Well, it was a Portuguese captain, but the boat was owned by the Dutch. The Dutch came and brought 20 slaves and says, we hear you have tons of tobacco, and we hear you have a problem getting people here despite indentured servitude and despite headright system. Well, here's a solution right here. Why don't you just buy these slaves? And it was there that the House of Burgesses passed laws that allowed this to happen, and they also passed different or adopted slave codes from Barbados. I think I talk about that in subsequent slides here. That will become very important in terms of how we manage things. So here is the Virginia House of Burgesses. Please know this, because it always shows up somewhere, either a multiple choice or as a possible SAQ question. Again, simply put, what takes place in Virginia is a microcosm of what the king wants to do across all of their colonies that are economically driven. And so the Jamestown and other towns that will soon form in the Carolinas and into Georgia's will become models of what the king wants it to look like, from everything from the economic foundations to the political structure, from the House of Burgesses, to the social structure of the nobilities and aristocracy, all the way down to the Church of England being the center point of their religious principles and practices there. Well, there's a second group, while I itch my nose, that forms, and it's called Maryland. And Maryland is unique in one way, and that, remember how I mentioned that not all Costcos are the same? Well, Maryland, although kissing cousin, I'm talking right next door to Virginia, having very similar fertile soils that's capable of growing tons of tobacco, amazing fertile region, has one new idea. And basically, Maryland was given to by King Charles to a nobleman named Calvert. Now, Calvert appoints a guy named Lord Baltimore, notice Baltimore, Maryland, to govern the colony. And what made this unique is that both of these men were Catholic. And under the new king, Catholicism was being attacked heavily and they were being persecuted. And even though they were nobles and lords, as lords and nobles, they weren't able to vote in the elections. Even though there was this act of religious toleration, etc., they still were second or third class citizens. So because of this, in the New World, in this new region they call Maryland, there would be a new sense of religious toleration. As long as you're not Jewish, by the way. That's another sidebar that maybe you'll pick up on, that type of thing. But please know this religious toleration is what is the marquee for Maryland. Virginia is tobacco and the House of Burgesses. Maryland is the religious toleration that comes from this. This is a map I'll talk about in class, but just recognize that it's the waterways that offer the greatest fertile soil, and that's where you see the greatest amount of British colonies there. It is not yet, a collision course with the Native Americans until later as more keep moving in here. Well, we now have Carolina moving in, and Carolina is established as King Charles is the second now, is trying to reestablish their authority because Cromwell is out. I don't want to complicate this type of thing. And he gives to his 8 crony buddies a new colony they call Carolina. And it is there that Carolina as well begins to rely on tobacco, but they're also going to look into probably developing this thing called rice. Why rice? Well, rice is helpful to feed the people of Barbados. What's happening in Barbados and the Bahamas is every free land, available land that's down there, I don't know if I have a picture of it, I don't think I do, but anything that's down there is being used to grow sugar, because sugar needs huge amount of space and arable land in order to grow, to then cut down the canes in order to grind it up, to juice it, to turn it into that confection called sugar, right? Well, if all the land's being used to grow sugar, how are they going to feed everybody there? Well, they look to the colonies as such a place that can grow the foodstuffs for them. So Carolina is linked very, very closely to what is happening down there in the Bahamas. Okay, so please remember that, and especially as we begin talking about the growth and expansion of the slave trade. So here's a little chart that I'll talk a little bit more about in class, but please note, here we have the red line where indentured servants are coming in from London, and you see ups and downs of that, but you definitely do see a trend where it's going. Okay, here we saw this is the headright system, so we did see it help a little bit, but because it's declining, or because they find out that many of the indentured servants who come don't work very well in the tobacco or the rice fields, you see here starting way back when, remember 1619, barely in Virginia there's 20 slaves, you see slavery populations going up dramatically in order to meet the demands there of the colonies. Okay. Again, I mentioned earlier that different colonies had to approach the growing slave populations, and so was the House of Burgesses in 1660, almost 40 years after, that began adopting the Barbados codes, they're called, that basically said that the slaves were inherited, that their mothers, passed children to them, that they can be beaten or mistreated and all these various things. It was just a deplorable act that on American soil, laws had passed that allowed for the laborers to be enslaved. So even though slavery was abolished in Europe, it's interesting how it is allowed to continue on the colonies in order for the sugar and the cotton, well, eventually cotton and tobacco, to move forward on things. Well, not all is good. If you remember those timeshares I talked about, and all those promises that should have been fulfilled with indentured servants getting their land and the headright people, accumulating more land, well, at some point, by the time that they did leave and got land, all the good land was taken. And as these indentured servants were released from their bond and they went to take over their land, they discovered, wow, it was so far inland, it was hard to develop the soil, let alone make it grow effectively with tobacco. And second, they had to face a lot of collision with the Native Americans that were living there and tremendous conflict between the both of them. They turned to the governor, Sir William Berkeley, who kind of ignored them and like, dude, sorry, we gave you the land. We didn't promise you protection and this type of thing. And so eventually there was this guy named Nathaniel Bacon who basically took matters in his own hands. So Nathaniel Bacon, which made him unique in this situation, along with wealthy landowners, these weren't part of the Berkeley's friends and cohorts, but wealthy landowners, a white indentured servants, and even slaves, okay, or freed slaves, if you want to call them that. These four people groups joined in Nathaniel Bacon's rebellion. And in a shorter period of time, they kicked they kicked Berkeley out of office. He fled because he's a weakling, okay. Election was held. Bacon's men won the House of Burgesses, putting them firmly there. While they were about to take Jamestown and conquer it themselves, Bacon dies of dysentery, and Berkeley by then amasses more soldiers sent over from England and takes back the power to be. Here's a picture of Nathaniel Bacon right here telling his agenda and plans to him, Lord Berkeley. Interestingly, he was, I think, a brother-in-law to him. So it's kind of interesting how they have brother versus or family versus family in the matters here of the colony. So what is the result of Bacon's rebellion? This is very, very important for you to know that this is a recognition that there's conflict between settlers and American Indians, and this conflict is not only not going to go away, it's only going to become exacerbated as the wound keeps getting opened more and more to this time. And so this made the King of England, this made the Royal Charter Company, since it's economically based, say, how can we do this different? We don't like the fact that white people are linking up with the slaves. We do that, soon we'll keep having these rebellions. What can we do to kind of make them happy? And so they passed a few laws to do this that kept the white people better improved and the black people even more subservient, and thus continues this slave system that is not healthy or good by any measure of the means. Let's go on to the one of our final topics here, and this is daily life in the colonies. And this is where, since uniquely, since women were scarce and very few of them were around, it was not unusual for many of them to be in charge of their husbands' businesses or husbands' estates or husbands' plantations. They had a very vital, important role. And in fact, some of them even had legal status when they arrived that if their husband had died, all the land would go through them. That would be matrilineal. This was unheard of in England at the time, unheard of in most European nations. It was all patrilineal descent that things were done. But this was needed because there were so few women there, and there would be no willingness of families to move to the colonies if there was no way to pass down from generation to generation this land or accumulated wealth. But as more women arrived, sadly, less and less had rights to do this and were relegated to more of a domestic role during this time. But we'll talk about that domestic role a little bit later on. So what we see as an end result of these early colonies of Carolina, of Maryland, and Virginia is that there is a huge division of rich and poor. We see only a few landowners owning all of the good land. We see almost 2/3 of the white families have been given their land, but these are small chunks of land that don't produce a whole lot, so they'll never be able to compete against the large landowner markets and politics and courts that they have created. We see Nathaniel Bacon and that movement of rebellion that could swell up at any time that needs to be addressed. And we see that even the free black settlers have very few opportunities to do that time. And coming to a close, we see our colonies. Remember I said, back to the beginning, no two Costco's are alike on the inside. They're configured vastly different. Well, here with the colonies growing, we see vast different ethnic groups coming into the colonies and taking up certain areas to that. Okay, well, of course, there's African along the coast here because that's where all of the tobacco and the cotton and the rice fields will be. But as we look to the hinterland along this fall line where you see the mountain passes, North Carolina we would call that nowadays the Appalachians. That is where you see the Germans and the Scots-Irish going, which will lead to the starting of Pennsylvania and the Quaker religion and other things that I'll talk about in subsequent lectures. But please be mindful that all of these colonists who came for really two things, either economic opportunities or religious freedoms. That's the exact thing, if we go all the way back to the very top and the very beginning, that if you look at this chart here, what were the colonies that came for economic reasons and which colonies were founded for religious reasons? If you can keep those clearly defined in your mind, you're going to do just fine. Now, for those of you who want to go drill deeper into the slavery concern, we're going to talk more about that when we get into the next time period. But here's an article that talks about Virginia's role in the Atlantic trade network in 1619. So I encourage you to read that to gain a different perspective as to what's happening. So to conclude, we recognize that it's geography and environment that is really driving the changes across this new landscape called the American colonies. And what is driving this? Sheer profit. And what is the profit? Through a cash crop called tobacco. And this tobacco product becomes one of the most profitable crops that it will be imported into Europe. It will be second to sugar, but for right now, it is the biggest thing that everybody in Europe seems to want at that hand. So on that note, keep it classy, Golden Bears. It's been a pleasure, and we'll see you next time.